Hey guys, Brockshield here, back with you with the next video in our series, Great Expectations by Charles Dickens. Without further ado, returning to Great Expectations. Some medical beast had revived tar water in those days as a fine medicine, and Mrs. Joe always kept a supply of it in the cupboard, having a belief in its virtues correspondent to its nastiness. At the best of times, so much of this elixir was administered to me as a choice restorative that I was conscious of going about smelling like a new fence. On this particular evening, the urgency of my case demanded a pint of this mixture, which was poured down from my throat. For my greater comfort, while Mrs. Joe held my head under her arm, as a boot would be held in a boot jack. Joe got off with half a pint, but was made to swallow that, much to his disturbance. As he sat slowly munching and meditating before the fire, because he had had a turn. Judging from myself, I should say he certainly had a turn afterwards. If he had had none before. Conscience is a dreadful thing when it accuses man or boy, but when, in the case of a boy, the secret burden cooperates with another secret burden down the leg of his trousers, it is, as I can testify, a great punishment. The guilty knowledge that I was going to rob Mrs. Joe. I never thought I was going to rob Joe, for I never thought of any of the housekeeping property as his, united to the necessity of always keeping one hand on my bread and butter as I sat, or when I was ordered about the kitchen on a small errand, almost drove me out of my mind. Then, as the marsh winds made the fire glow and flare, I thought I had heard the voice outside of the man with the iron on his leg, who had sworn me to secrecy, declaring that he couldn't and wouldn't starve until tomorrow, but must be fed now. At other times, I thought, what if the young man who was with so much difficulty restrained from imbruing his hands in me should yield to a constitutional impatience, or should mistake the time, and should think himself accredited to my heart and liver tonight, instead of tomorrow? If ever anybody's hair stood on end with terror, mine must have done so then, but perhaps nobody's ever did. It was Christmas Eve, and I had to stir the pudding for the next day with a copper stick from 7 to 8 by the Dutch clock. I tried it with the load upon my leg, and that made me think afresh of the man with the load on his leg. And found the tendency of exercise to bring the bread and butter out at my ankle quite unmanageable. Happily, I slipped away and deposited that part of my conscience in my garret bedroom. "Hark!" said I, when I had done my stir, and was taking a final warm in the chimney corner before being sent up to bed. "Was that great guns, Joe?" "Ah," said Joe, "there's another convict off." "What does that mean, Joe?" said I. Mrs. Joe, who always took explanations upon herself, said snappishly, "Escaped, escaped," administering the definition like tar water, while Mrs. Joe sat with her head bending over her needlework. I put my mouth into the forms of saying to Joe, "What's a convict?" Joe put his mouth into the forms of returning such a highly elaborate answer that I could make out nothing of it but the single word "pip." "There was a convict off last night," said Joe aloud. "After sunset gone, and they fired warning of him. And now, it appears they're firing warning of another." "Who's firing?" said I. Drat that boy, interposed my sister, frowning at me over her work. What a questioner he is. Ask no questions and you'll be told no lies. It was not very polite to herself, I thought, to imply that I should be told lies by her, even if I did ask the question. But she was never polite unless there was company. At this point, Joe greatly augmented my curiosity by taking the utmost pains to open his mouth very wide, and to put it into the form of a word that looked to me like sulks. Therefore, I naturally pointed to Mrs. Joe and put my mouth into the form of saying, her? But Joe wouldn't hear of that at all, and again opened his mouth very wide, and shook the form of a most empathetic word out of it. But I could make nothing of the word. Mrs. Joe, said I as a last resort, I should like to know, if you wouldn't much mind, where the firing comes from. Lord bless the boy, exclaimed my sister, as if she didn't quite mean that, but rather the contrary. From the hulks. Oh, said I, looking at Joe. Hulks! Joe gave a reproachful cough as much as to say, well, I told you so. And please, what's hulks? Said I. That's the way with this boy, exclaimed my sister, pointing me out with her needle and thread, and shaking her head at me. Answer him one question, and he'll ask you a dozen directly. Hulks are prison ships, right across the meshes. We always use that name for marshes in our country. I wonder who's put into prison ships and why they're put there, said I, in a general way and with quiet desperation. It was too much for Mrs. Joe, who immediately rose. I tell you what, young fella, said she, I didn't bring you up by hand to badger people's lives out. It would be blame to me and not praise if I had. People are put in the hulks because they murder, and because they rob, and forge, and do all sorts of bad. And they always begin by asking questions. Now you get along to bed. I was never allowed a candle to light me to bed, and as I went upstairs in the dark with my head tingling, from Mrs. Joe's thimble having played the tambourine upon it to accompany her last words, I felt fearfully sensible of the great convenience that the hulks were handy for me. I was clearly on my way there. I had begun by asking questions, and I was going to rob Mrs. Joe. Since that time, which is far enough away now, I have often thought that few people know what secrecy there is in the young under terror. No matter how unreasonable the terror, so that it be terror, I was in mortal terror of the young man who wanted my heart and liver. I was in mortal terror of my interlocutor with the ironed leg. I was in mortal terror of myself, from whom an awful promise had been extracted. I had no hope of deliverance through my all-powerful sister, who repulsed me at every turn. I am afraid to think of what I might have done on requirement in the secrecy of my terror. If I slept at all that night, it was only to imagine myself drifting down the river on a strong spring tide to the hulks, a ghostly pirate calling out to me through a speaking trumpet as I passed the gibbet station that I had better come ashore and be hanged there at once, and not put it off. I was afraid to sleep, even if I had been inclined, for I knew that at the first faint dawn of morning I must rob the pantry. There was no doing it in the night, for there was no getting a light by easy friction then, to have got one. I must have struck it out of flint and steel, and have made a noise like the very pirate himself rattling his chains. We'll go ahead and stop there for this week. As usual, I want to say thank you for watching, and I hope you enjoyed. Please like, comment, and subscribe, as it greatly helps the channel. Light be with you all. Take care, and thanks again.